Shawn, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
Wonderful. It's great to be here with you.
Fantastic. I am actually going to ask you the origins of your name because I don't think I've asked you that before.
It's Croatian, actually. My grandfather immigrated from Croatia to the United States in the early 1900s.
Beautiful place. I hope you've been back.
Gorgeous place. Yes, I've spent a lot of time there and love getting to that part of the world. It's a gorgeous area.
Fantastic. So, in the introduction, I referred to you as a trend caster, which actually is a new term for me. I've not used that about a speaker before. Could you define what a trend caster is, please?
Sure, sure. When I think about trend casting, I'm thinking about tracking and also forecasting the global trends that are going to impact different organizations. I'm often positioned as a futurist. I think one of the things that I'm hesitant around that futurist term is that it gives you this idea of an oracle looking into a crystal ball, and it's much more methodical than that. It's looking at all of these forces, many of them building over decades, happening on the peripheral that are impacting organizations going forward. So as I think about how all of these forces impact organizations, how they're changing business, I'm looking at projecting that forward, and that's the trend cast, looking at the trends, forecasting, and bringing those both together.
And you actually look at not only technology, but you also look at the economic side because you are an economist.
Definitely. I try to find that intersection of what's really driving organizations from an economic and finance standpoint. So my background is economics and finance. I have a PhD in economics and have spent a lot of time in the financial realm, but then also bringing in the technology forces that are at play and how that's impacting these organizations. I think there's lots building in that horizon as well. So finding the intersection between those forces.
Fantastic. And you talk about datafication. I hope I said that correctly.
You
Not
did,
an,
yes.
not an easy word with these teeth, I tell you. And explain to me what datafication is and how it's influencing consumers.
Sure, I would argue that we're moving into the next era of transformation. So the first era, the era that has really taken hold over the last 2 decades, we've long talked about digitization. And really, some of that dates back many, many decades. We got the first digital computer in 1942. We got the first hard drive in 1956. And so it was decades in the making until these technologies finally came to fruition over the last 2 decades. And really, if you look back at 2000, just 19 years ago, 20 years ago now, we were still living in a very analog world. Only about 3% of us were on broadband. Only about 40% of us had home computers. So we still lived a very analog world where our work wasn't really infused with these digital technologies yet. And then in quick succession, we began replacing all of our analog products with digital ones. So we replaced analog televisions with digital ones. We replaced analog cameras with digital ones. And slowly, surely, we then embedded these digital technologies in our lives, in our work, and that started to influence what we were doing. And I would argue we're now moving to the next decade of transformation as we move from digitization to datafication. And what we're seeing is taking all of the information that is available within our organizations and repurposing that, redeploying that information into our organizations and changing the way that we actually operate, changing the way we make decisions. It's happening among consumers. It's happening among business executives. We're all feeling these forces. And as a result, it brings about many implications for us as individuals, but also for executives across a variety of organizations.
Oh, that's fascinating. Hopefully, it's going to bring us some good improvements, especially as consumers for us in our experiences. So, everybody's talking about AI, artificial intelligence, and in your opinion, how should organizations be thinking about AI?
AI is something that is pervasive, and it's becoming increasingly pervasive, and it's going to impact every organization. So I think first and foremost, organizations need to recognize that AI will influence their business in some way. And it will also influence the role of the executive in some way. This is something that I'm seeing as I work with organizations. it isn't enough that it just changes the organization, but it actually changes what every individual executive does, whether that's the CEO, the CTO, the CFO, head of HR, everyone from the very top of the organization across to every role is being influenced by artificial intelligence in some way. And so I think first and foremost, organizations need to recognize that this is coming into their organization. I often talk with businesses that say, oh, we see how this is impacting other industries, but it's not going to come to our industry. And I think with respect to AI and many of these other emerging technologies, that over time it will come into your organization and influence your organization. I like to say that technology moves very slowly until suddenly it doesn't. And that's really what you're preparing for as an executive. You're preparing for that time when technology moves very rapidly and over a short period of time really changes how you operate.
Do you know, it doesn't feel slow to me, but I know exactly what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. So you mentioned emerging technologies. Are there any that executives should be excited about?
I think there's a lot of technologies for executives to be excited about. Certainly, artificial intelligence is one of those technologies, and I think it has tremendous promise and tremendous opportunity. I think that augmented reality, virtual reality, everything that's happening in that space, as those come together and create a mixed reality environment, I think you're going to see those impact organizations in really interesting ways. And you see that datafication taking hold there as well. Augmented reality is essentially taking what's happening in the physical space and adding in additional information. So you could imagine that I could walk into a retail environment and using augmented reality, the technology that I've got available to me today on my smartphone, I can get additional information about the products that I see there or the experience that I'm seeing there. Just recently, we saw that Google, for example, is introducing a new feature that allows you to hold your phone up to the menu in a restaurant, and it will highlight on the menu the items that are most popular. So it's taking that information that's digitally available that we're using in services like Yelp, and it's blurring it and mixing it with what's happening in the physical space. That to me is what's happening in this era of datafication, where you're taking the best of what's happening in the digital world, you're blending it with the way we're operating in the physical world, and you're producing an entirely new experience. That concept, that idea is going to come to every organization, and it's going to come in a lot of very interesting and unique ways.
I mean, what's fascinating about that, I mean, I would never even thought of that as a thing to do. And
Right.
so how do you, as an executive, prepare for the changes that are coming in 5 to 10 years when you might not even be able to predict them?
I think you bring up a really valid point. And one thing that I see executives struggle with is that they're often looking at very long investment horizons. So you think of something like the hospitality industry, where they're investing in assets that have 40, 50-year lifespans. So they're thinking about putting in a hotel or a facility that they're going to invest in over many decades. And yet underlying technology is changing rapidly. The design cycle for a smartphone is only 9 months. And so this mismatch that happens between the technological cycles and the long-lived assets that these companies are employing. And you see it in every industry. Manufacturers investing in manufacturing facilities that they want to have last for many decades. I mentioned hospitalities, hospitals, obviously, and healthcare, investing in these long-lived assets that they expect these facilities to be around for decades. Construction is one that's being impacted where they're thinking about these long-lived assets. So the first thing that executives need to think about is what the mismatch is between their life cycle, their lifespans for the assets that they're employing, and then some of these technological forces. As we move to this era of datafication, data plays a more important role. So executives need to think about, what data do we have? How are we capturing it? How are we organizing it? How are we structuring it? Are we making it available to different parts of the organization? Also, how are we ensuring that it's protected in a world of cybersecurity intrusions and cyber attacks? How do we ensure that the data we have is protected? How do we ensure that it's proprietary and that we can use it for our customers and clients without it falling into the hands of of our competitors. So there's a lot around data management, data organization. We talk a lot about AI, but really 80% of AI is data structure, data organization. Those are the initial steps. So as companies start to think about how do I automate services in the future, how do I start to embed AI into what we do, it starts with a culture around data. And I think while we talk a lot about the technical tools that are needed, every organization needs to start to think about how do I build a new culture? How do I build a culture around data? How do I structure our organization in a way that can take full advantage of these emerging technologies that are coming about? So it isn't enough to buy a technology and deploy it. You have to change the organization. You're often changing the structure, you're changing the roles of your executives, and you're changing the culture. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of organizations are just waking up to. Executives are just recognizing, it isn't enough to just buy this technology, but I have to change the actual culture of my organization.
Wow, gosh. I mean, it's hard to be an executive these days, I think. You mentioned quite a few different sectors. Is there a sector or an industry that you think is facing the biggest disruption, the biggest changes?
I think you're seeing this as we shift from digitization to datafication impacting every industry, but at different rates and in different ways. So if you think of something like food services, how do they start to think about what the drive-through window of a fast food chain looks like in a world that eventually might have self-driving vehicles? And what does that experience look like? So today, anywhere from 60 to 70% of the revenue for a fast food chain is coming through its drive-through window. But what happens when a vehicle shows up and it doesn't have somebody inside? And how does that experience look for that fast food restaurant? And again, here's a long-lived asset that they've put in place. It's a major contributor to their revenue, and yet that's starting to change because the technology on the receiving end is starting to change. Also, at the same time, technologies within the organization are starting to change. So as I travel the world and as I talk to different organizations, one thing that's become abundantly clear is that every country is going to be impacted by these trends and by these shifts. As well, we're also going to see that every industry is going to be impacted by these shifts, but in very different ways. So if you think of something like augmented reality, which we just talked about, it will impact the experience that the consumer is having, but it also will impact the experience that managers are having, that executives are having, and that other employees are having. We're starting to see augmented reality used in a variety of settings, from hospitals to warehouses, and so that technology will change the role of every employee across every type of organization. So I think that's one of the things that executives need to be aware of, that it will come to you eventually, and it will change the way that you're operating.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you about a technology now that is in discussion a great deal here in the UK, and I don't know if it is anywhere else, but there's a lot of controversy around 5G technology. And the argument here in the UK is that it hasn't been tested out enough to ensure that it's safe. Do you have any views on 5G? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Should we be worried?
So there is definitely a lot of conversation today on 5G. Also, a lot of conversations around, is it safe or not? And I think one of the things to recognize is that 5G is very different than 4G. We so often take technologies and we just think they're an extension of what we've always known. But 5G is really fundamentally different than 4G in many ways. First and foremost, it is faster. So it provides greater throughput. It allows us to move information at a much faster clip. As a kind of quick example of that, in a 3G environment, it takes about 26 hours to download a 2-hour movie. So you can think back to when we were on 3G Blackberries, we never streamed video content. It was such a horrible experience, such a painful experience that we didn't really do it. As we move to a 4G environment, we move that 2-hour download from 26 hours to 6 minutes. So it changes significantly, and then we start to stream content as if we've always done it. And it's hard to remember a time where we didn't go to YouTube or go to Netflix or go to any other content that we wanted to consume on our mobile devices. As we move from 4G to 5G environment, we are able to take a 2-hour video download and move it from 6 minutes to under 4 seconds. Now, it doesn't mean that we're just going to download more movies, but what will happen is that we will start to use that technology in very different ways. Just as when we went from 3G to 4G, we use that technology in new ways. Same will happen as we go from 4G to 5G. 5G is used at a higher bandwidth, so we tend to need much more towers in an area, and it's really designed with specific use cases in mind. It's really good for moving a lot of information across a lot of devices in a very short area. And so urban settings make a lot of sense. And also, if you think about manufacturing and the way we're connecting technologies in a manufacturing facility, 5G makes a lot of sense. With things like self-driving vehicles, 5G will probably play a role. It isn't a replacement of 4G. It's an extension of 4G, and it's pushing cellular connectivity into entirely new ways. So it's going to impact areas like entertainment, manufacturing that I mentioned. It'll change the way we connect information. Certainly, it's going to give birth to smart cities and allowing information to move around these urban settings and capture information about these environments that we didn't know in the past. So we still, in a lot of these areas, live in a very analog world. Maybe the devices are connected, but we're not actually capturing information about everything that's happening in that environment. That's one of the things that that 5G will enable. So with a new technology, going back to your original question about safety, there's a lot of testing going on right now to ensure that it's safe. And because it operates different than 4G, it looks like those early tests, at least right now, suggest that it is safe. But like with every technology, it's important to continue to test these in new environments, because as I noted, we're going to use this technology in new ways. And so it's important to look at those technologies in those new ways.
It's fascinating. I mean, I remember, because I'm old enough, when the first microwave oven came out, and there was fear around the microwave, and
Sure.
people not wanting to be near it when it was on. And now I think everybody in their kitchen has these. So it is fascinating to see that. So Shawn, your depth of knowledge, depth and breadth of knowledge is enormous. What are clients currently asking you to come and talk about when they're inviting you into conferences and events? What are the trending topics you're seeing?
Obviously, artificial intelligence is one of those trending topics, what it means for my organization, what it means for me. I also see a subtle nuance starting to take hold. Executives are really interested in looking at how these emerging technologies are going to change different roles within the organization. So what does the future of work look like? I'm seeing executives across the board become more strategically focused, and they're pushing their individual roles to greater alignment with the strategic goals of the organization. So for example, the HR executive is now thinking about, what do I do as an HR executive, and how do I use these technologies to align my role with the strategic role of the organization, and how do I further the strategic aims of the organization. So I see executives across the board, whether it's operations, finance, HR, really focused on aligning their roles with the strategic direction of the organization. So future of work is a big topic. How these emerging technologies are going to change their organization, change the competitive landscape, are very important topics that I've seen a lot of companies thinking about today.
Okay, fantastic, fascinating. So you're a recognized authority, you're an expert, you're approached to speak regularly, but obviously this started some time ago and you've been doing this a while. If you could go back to yourself when you were starting out as a speaker and being booked for events and conferences, what advice would you give yourself about the speaking industry, about speaking? What would you say to your younger self? Although you're still very young, I'd say.
Well, I was lucky to work for many years for an organization that puts on some of the biggest events in the world. And so I know firsthand how much work goes into organizing an event. And I know how much work event planners are pouring into these jobs. And then often they think they're going in one direction, and then their CEO gives them a new mandate, and they quickly have to shift direction. So I know how much focus goes on making sure every last detail is executed perfectly. I think the advice that I give myself every day, and the advice I would give other speakers, is to recognize that this is a partnership. You aren't just showing up to give a speech and then jumping back in a car and headed back to the airport, but that this is a partnership where you really want to see that event thrive, and you want to see that event achieve excellence. And so even today, I try to do as much as I can to ensure that these events are successful. I also think that the world of speaking is starting to change. It isn't enough anymore to just show up, give a speech, and then bolt for the door. I think organizations are wanting more, and I think they deserve more. I think in a world of social media, there's the ability to leverage the platform that the speaker has. I think we're seeing the use of video interactions increase the engagement beyond the traditional 45-minute or 60-minute keynote. So they're using video before the event, they're using video after the event to follow up, they're writing blog posts or magazine articles. And so extending the engagement beyond just the keynote itself, but really creating a vibrant partnership that's going to drive ROI to that organization, whether it's a public event or a private event, ensuring that those attendees, the audience, are really getting a lot of meat out of the event. And I also think that audiences today are really demanding to be educated. They really want to understand the impact that these trends are going to have on their organizations and on them as individuals. And they really want meaty presentations. So not just focusing on a great presentation, but also a presentation that is really informative and has a lot of interesting information. So it's finding that balance between being interesting and entertaining, but also informative, really letting them leave with tangible takeaways that they can employ the second they walk away from that event.
And that's invaluable advice. And having worked with you, I know you not only talk it, but you walk it. You do go above and beyond, and you are a pleasure to work with. So thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful to join you.